Chapter 15. Duality demonstrated by anatomy. Thus far, the proofs adduced in support of the dual hypothesis have been confined to the facts of experimental hypnotism and the various other forms of psychic phenomena. This has been done for the reason that in themselves those facts are amply demonstrative of the truth of the hypothesis. But it has often been asked if the facts of cerebral anatomy, physiology, or experimental surgery throw any light whatever upon the subject. This is a pertinent question, because, if those facts are irreconcilable with the hypothesis, the latter must fail under the inexorable rule that one clearly demonstrated adverse fact is sufficient to disprove the most plausible hypothesis. If, therefore, the dual hypothesis is the true one, all the facts of nature, whether of psychic phenomena or of physical structure, must conspire to demonstrate it. At least, there must be no fact that will disprove it. Thus, if it could be clearly demonstrated that the brain is the sole organ of the mind, the hypothesis of duality must fail for want of a plurality of organs through which a second mind could manifest itself. It is true that the brain itself is dual in a purely physical sense. That is, there are two hemispheres, but it is demonstrable that they are duplicate organs of the same mind. There is no evidence, except in novels, that the two hemispheres are not identical in function and normally synchronous in action. If, therefore, duality of mind is to be demonstrated by reference to the physical structure of the animal man, we must expect to find an organ for one of the minds outside of the brain and measurably independent of its conditions or even of its existence. It must, moreover, be the organ of the subjective mind, for it is demonstrable that the brain is the organ of the objective faculties. The organ of the subjective mind must, therefore, be the organ of the instinctive faculties. If it is the organ of the instinctive faculties, it is necessarily the organ of the faculties of intuition and all the others which have been designated as subjective. Fortunately, we have not far to look for demonstrative evidence that the required organ exists, not only in man, but in the lower animals as well. In support of this declaration, I shall now cite some passages from the writings of one of the ablest living scientists, namely, Surgeon General Hammond. What he has said on the subject was written without reference to the dual hypothesis, and certainly without reference to its bearings upon the question of a future life. It has, therefore, all the greater evidential value, for that it was written solely in the interests of pure science, and by one whose professional reputation as an alienist is international, whose works have been translated into every modern language, and are used as textbooks by the medical profession in every civilized country. More than 20 years ago, Dr. Hammond delivered an address before the New York Neurological Society entitled "The Brain Not the Sole Organ of the Mind," in which he demonstrated his thesis by a collection of authorities, by original experiments, and by arguments which have never been successfully controverted. In one of his later works, he has incorporated the gist of that address in a chapter entitled "The Seat of Instinct." It is from the latter work that I make the following extracts. The brain of man is more highly developed than that of any other animal. He has reasoning powers in excess of those possessed by any living being. His mind governs the world, and, not content with that, seeks for knowledge of those spheres beyond that in which he dwells. But, with all this, he is surpassed by almost every other animal in the ability to perform acts instinctively, by beings, in fact, whose brains are infinitely less perfect than his, and by others which have no organs corresponding to a brain. If the instinct of man were seated in his brain, he would doubtless exhibit a development of this faculty so great as to place him on that score as high as he now stands as regards his mind. Going back, for the present, to some of the lower animals, we find that we are able, by certain experimental procedures, to settle some points relative to the seat of instinct with absolute certainty. It does not reside exclusively in the brain. The brain of many animals, especially of those belonging to the class of reptiles, can be removed without the animal suffering any very considerable immediate inconvenience. In such cases, the instinct remains unimpaired. Thus Maine de Byron states that, according to Perrault, a viper, the head of which had been cut off, moved without deviation to its hole in the wall. It is impossible that the viper could have seen, heard, smelt, tasted, or felt the wall. It could only have gone toward it instinctively, through the action of a force not residing in its brain, and altogether independent of perception. It is an instinct in certain animals to swim when placed in water. I removed the entire brain of a frog, and, After waiting a few minutes for the animal to recover from the shock of the operation, I placed it in a tub of water. It immediately began to swim. I held my hand so that the animal's head would come in contact with it, and thus further progress be prevented. Continued efforts to swim were made for a few seconds, and then ceased. Removing my hand, the animal again swam. I have repeatedly performed similar experiments with turtles of various kinds, and lately with water snakes. In all these cases, the whole brain was removed from the cranium, yet the animals did not wobble about aimlessly in the water, but swam straight out into the stream or pond, apparently with as complete a purpose to escape as though they still possessed the full degree of consciousness of the unmutilated animals. Such experiments show, beyond a doubt, that perception and volition are not seated exclusively in the brain, and thus that instinct is not indissolubly connected with that organ. It is impossible to make similar investigations in the higher animals with such definite results as those obtained with reptiles, but we may call to mind the fact familiar to all physiologists, and to which reference has been made in an earlier part of this work, of the behavior of a pigeon the brain of which had been removed. Though in such a case most of the actions are the result of perception, yet some, as for instance the act of flying when it is thrown into the air, are purely instinctive. But nature has performed many experiments for us, and these not only on the lower animals, but also on man, which teach us conclusively that even in him instinct does not reside in brain. They show, too, that certain faculties of the mind are not confined to that organ, but with that fact we need not at present concern ourselves. In certain monsters born without a brain, or with important parts of this organ absent, we have interesting examples of the persistence of instinct. Syme describes one of these beings which lived for 6 months. Though very feeble, it had the faculty of sucking, and the several functions of the body appeared to be well performed. Its eyes clearly perceived the light, and during the night it cried if the candle was allowed to go out. After death the cranium was opened, and there was found to be an entire absence of the cerebrum, the place of which was occupied by a quantity of serous fluid contained in the arachnoid. The cerebellum and pons virolii were present. Olivier Diage describes a monster of the female sex which lived 20 hours. It cried, and could suck and swallow. There was no brain, but the spinal cord and medulla oblongata were well developed. Saviard relates the particulars of a case in which there were no cerebrum, cerebellum, or any other intracranial ganglion. The spinal cord began as a little red tumor on a level with the foramen magnum. Yet this being opened and shut its eyes, cried, sucked, and even ate broth. It lived 4 days. Some of these movements were reflex, but others were clearly instinctive and adapted to the preservation of life. Du Bois, on the authority of Professor Lallemand of Montpellier, cites the case of a fetus born at full term, in which the cerebrum and cerebellum were entirely absent. There were no ganglionic bodies within the cranium, but the medulla oblongata and the pons virolii. This fetus lived 3 days. During all this time it uttered cries, exercised suction movements when anything was put into its mouth, and moved the limbs. It was nourished with milk and sweetened water, for no nurse would give it her breast. Du Bois cites another case, on the authority of Spessa of Treviso, of a child born without cerebrum, cerebellum, or medulla oblongata, in which lived 11 hours. It cried, breathed, and moved its limbs, but it did not suck. It is difficult to say of this case to what extent its movements were instinctive, and to what extent reflex. But all these instances, as well as the experiments referred to as having been performed on lower animals, show that instinct does not reside in the brain. It is seated exclusively in the medulla oblongata, or in the spinal cord, or in both these organs. The observations made in experiments cited under the immediately preceding head apparently lead to the conclusion that the medulla oblongata, or spinal cord, or both the organs, may be the seat of instinct. And further inquiry shows that this view is as correct as that which associates the brain with the mind. Dr. Hammond then goes on at length to cite many intensely interesting experiments of his own, demonstrating the marvelous strength and persistency of instinctive acts and emotions after all the intracranial ganglia were completely removed. He closes the chapter as follows. In microcephali and other human idiots, the instincts are sometimes exceedingly strong and remain so through life. I have already referred to the instance of one of these creatures, an adult woman, holding a rag baby in her arms as though it were a child, and in whom the maternal instinct must have been strong, and entirely uncontrolled by the intellect. Some idiots also evince a great instinctive talent for music and for arithmetical calculations, which, although capable of development, as are other instincts, are nevertheless innate. From these facts, and many others which might be adduced in a work specially directed to the consideration of the many interesting points involved, I think it may be concluded that instinct has at least its chief, if not its only, seat in the medulla oblongata and spinal cord. It is possible that the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the pons varolii have some influence in strengthening the faculty, but this is not essential, and its exercise is not a mental operation. It will now be seen that the hypothesis of a dual mind is sustained not alone by the phenomena evoked by experimental hypnotism, but by the physical structure of man himself, as well as of the whole animal creation. It will also be observed that whether we assume two distinct minds, or one mind with two distinct sets of faculties, the logical results are the same. Moreover, if there is but one mind, it is dual nevertheless. It is dual in its organism, it is dual in its functions, it is dual in its faculties, and all the logical conclusions derivable from the hypothesis of two minds are also derivable from the hypotheses of one mind with a dual organism. There is, indeed, one argument for continued existence in the single-mind theory which applies with somewhat diminished force to the theory of duality, for it may be plausibly argued that, if the mind can survive the destruction of one of its organs, there is no good reason why it may not survive the demolition of the other, together with the whole physical structure of which those organs are a necessary constituent element. But this leads directly into the forbidden field of speculation without facts. If a future life is to be demonstrated at all, it will not be by reference to physical structure, but by reference to psychic facts, the observable phenomena of the soul. When we have learned the fact that there is a physical structure adapted to a dual mental organization, we have learned about the only physical fact that can possibly be verified, that throws any light upon the subject of a future life or of the relations which the two sets of faculties sustain towards each other. It would be pleasant pastime to speculate upon the possible functions of the medulla oblongata or the cerebellum, but we can have no means of verifying such speculations. The very name and structure, however, of the pons varolii suggests its possible function as a bridge connecting the domains of the two intelligences, enabling them to hold communion and to act in synchronism. But, in the absence of a possibility of verifying such speculations, we should waste valuable time that could be much better employed in solving the problems presented by the psychic facts which are within easy range of our observation. I now wish to invite particular attention to two incidental remarks made by Dr. Hammond in the foregoing extracts. They show, too, that certain faculties of the mind are not confined to that organ, the brain. Again, he remarks that some idiots evince a great instinctive talent for music and for arithmetical calculations, which, although capable of development, as are other instincts, are nevertheless innate. The importance and far-reaching significance of the remark, and the fact embraced in it, cannot be overestimated. It is a clear and distinct recognition, by one of the ablest living scientists, of the fact that the higher functions of intellect may be, and are by man, performed instinctively, that is to say, by that mind which operates when the objective senses are inhibited, as in sleep or somnambulism, that mind which is often active and potent when there is a total absence of power in the objective mind, as in idiocy. That mind which performs its functions with undiminished power after the organ of the objective mind has been totally eliminated from the cranial cavity. The intelligent reader will at once recognize the fact that the musical and mathematical talents possessed by some idiots are illustrations of that class of phenomena which I have elsewhere designated as the power of intuitive perception of the laws of nature, for it is obvious that the musical power of an idiot must be the result of an intuitive or instinctive perception of the laws of harmony of sounds. The idiot's objective mind being extinct, he obviously has no facilities for learning those laws by means of objective education. The same remark applies to the power of an idiot to solve mathematical problems. Of course, these examples afford only brief and fleeting glimpses into the domain of subjective mental activity and power, but they are all sufficient to enable us definitely to locate the source and classify the phenomena. Moreover, it gives us the logical right to infer that faculties which exhibit such prodigious power under abnormal conditions, faculties which are demonstrably not of the brain, have a normal function to perform somewhere. And as they have no normal function in this life, it must be in a life to come. The fact that their greatest observable power is manifested when the functions of the brain are inhibited gives us the logical right to infer that the physical frame limits its power, and that when it is freed from material limitations, emancipated from the trammels of the flesh, its power of intuitional perception of all truth will be perfected. Not that its possessor will instantaneously become omniscient. That is a supposition which none but a Hindu philosopher, filled to saturation with that monstrous egotism which results from self-hypnotization, is capable of seriously advancing. The most that can be rationally postulated is that the finite, human entity, endowed with such powers, is invested with the potentiality of rapid intellectual and moral development and indefinite progress. It will now be conceded that whilst the existence of a dual mind in man is presumptively proven by the very nature of the phenomena exhibited, it is conclusively demonstrated by the facts of physiology and cerebral anatomy. Especially is this true since the facts of cerebral anatomy demonstrate the proposition that there can be no objective mind in the absence of a brain. In other words, as I have before remarked, the objective mind is the function of the brain and ceases when the brain dies or is destroyed. The subjective mind, on the other hand, belongs to an entity which is neither dependent for its existence nor for the power to perform its functions upon the vitality or even the existence of the brain. It may be asked at this point, if the objective mind is the function of the brain and they perish together, why may it not be true that the subjective mind is the function of the spinal cord and that it perishes with that organ? To this I reply that I allude to that question at this point merely for the purpose of showing that I am not unmindful of its pertinency, and I promise to make a full and complete answer to it in the ensuing chapters. The answer to that question pertains wholly to the problem of a future life, and the reader will bear in mind that in this chapter one am merely trying to demonstrate that the human entity has a dual mind, and having done that, I shall reserve the right to hold that, inasmuch as one of those minds clearly belongs to the body, the other as clearly belongs to the soul. It will then be in order to appeal to the facts, the observable phenomena of the soul, to demonstrate its continued existence after the death of the body. And that of itself will be found to be a clear and conclusive answer to the possible supposition that the subjective mind is merely the function of the spinal cord, or of the medulla oblongata, or of the pons ferolii, or of the cerebellum, or of any other organ of the body, that they, or some of them, together with the nervous system, are the organs of the subjective entity, by and through which it exercises its control over the functions, sensations, and conditions of the body during its sojourn in it, is quite another proposition, and it may be admitted to be true without argument. It has, however, nothing to do with the question under immediate consideration. Now let us summarize the foregoing demonstrable and demonstrated facts, so that we may have a clearer view of the effect of the whole. To put them in orderly form, we have the following clearly established propositions. 1. The objective mind is the function of the physical brain. It is wholly dependent upon the condition of that organ, and it ceases to exist when the brain loses its vitality. 2. Instinctive acts are performed by animals after the brain has been wholly excised from the cranial cavity and by human beings born without a brain or any other intracranial ganglion. 3. Intellectual feats of a high order, such as playing musical instruments, making mathematical calculations, and many others, belong to the realm of instinct, and are often performed by idiots, that is, by those destitute of objective intellect. It must be remembered that these propositions are based upon the facts which have been observed, tested, and recorded by some of the most eminent scientists, living or dead. They are demonstrative of the dual mind hypothesis, for they show that when one mind is wholly extinguished, either by natural causes as an idiocy, or by a surgical operation such as those described by Dr. Hammond, there is still a mind existent and capable of manifesting itself. It is thought, therefore, that it may now be fairly claimed that the two-mind theory has been demonstrated to be true. 1. Logically, because a. all the facts can be accounted for upon that hypothesis, b. because there is no other hypothesis that can account for all the facts, 2. because the facts of cerebral anatomy, physiology, and experimental surgery all conspire to demonstrate its truth.